Welcome to Just Stories. We hope you enjoy the story. Brother Against Brother, a chronicle of the Greek Civil War, by Just Stories. Chapter 1, The Roots of Conflict. In order to understand the Greek Civil War of 1944-45, it's important to look at the historical and political context that led up to it. The conflict had its roots in the complex and turbulent history of Greece in the early 20th century, and in the aftermath of World War II, tensions between different factions erupted into full-blown civil war. During World War II, Greece was occupied by the Axis powers, including Germany and Italy. The Greek resistance movement, which included both communist and non-communist groups, fought a bitter guerrilla war against the occupiers. After the war, when the Allies had liberated Greece, the country was plunged into a period of political and social upheaval. The Greek Communist Party emerged from the resistance as one of the most powerful political forces in the country. It had a significant presence in the armed forces and among the peasantry, who made up the majority of the Greek population at the time. The KKE was committed to a revolutionary socialist agenda and saw the post-war period as an opportunity to seize power. However, the KKE faced strong opposition from other political groups in Greece, including the center-right government that had been installed with the support of the British. These groups saw the KKE as a threat to the country's stability and democracy, and were determined to prevent it from gaining power. The tensions between the KKE and the government came to a head in the 1940s, when the KKE formed a guerrilla army called the Democratic Army of Greece. The DSE launched attacks on government forces and quickly gained control of large parts of the countryside. The government responded with force, and soon the country was engulfed in a full-scale civil war. The roots of the Greek Civil War can also be traced to wider geopolitical forces. The conflict was one of the many proxy wars fought between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The Soviet Union supported the KKE and the DSE, while the United States provided military and economic aid to the Greek government. The Greek Civil War was a complex and multifaceted conflict, with deep roots in the country's history and politics. While the immediate cause of the conflict was the tensions between the KKE and the government, the wider geopolitical context of the Cold War played a significant role in shaping its outcome. As we will see in the following chapters, the conflict had a profound impact on Greece and its people, and continues to be remembered and debated to this day. Chapter 2, The Battle for Athens. One of the most significant events in the Greek Civil War was the Battle for Athens, which took place in December 1944. The battle was a turning point in the conflict, and marked the beginning of the end for the communist guerrillas who had been fighting to gain control of the country. The battle began when the National Army, the military force of the Greek government, launched an offensive against the communist-controlled neighborhoods of Athens. The guerrillas responded with a fierce counterattack, and the fighting quickly escalated into a full-scale battle for the control of the city. The battle lasted for several weeks, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The communist guerrillas were initially able to hold their ground and launch successful counterattacks against government forces. However, the National Army was able to regroup and launch a massive assault on the city center, which eventually broke the back of the communist resistance. The Battle for Athens was a brutal and bloody conflict, with both sides committing atrocities and acts of violence. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, and many were killed or displaced as a result of the fighting. The outcome of the battle was a clear victory for the government and the National Army. The communist guerrillas were forced to retreat from Athens, and were never again able to launch a serious challenge to the government's control of the country. The Battle for Athens had significant implications for the Greek Civil War and for Greece as a whole. It marked the beginning of the end for the communist guerrillas, and paved the way for the government to reassert its authority over the country. However, the violence and destruction caused by the battle left deep scars on Greek society, and the memory of the conflict continued to shape Greek politics and culture for decades to come. Today, the Battle for Athens is remembered as one of the defining moments of the Greek Civil War, and as a symbol of the country's struggle for freedom and democracy. While the conflict itself was deeply divisive and destructive, the legacy of the battle continues to inspire and inform the Greek people as they strive to build a better future for their country. Chapter 3: The Guerrilla Movement. The Greek Civil War of 1944–45 was characterized by a fierce guerrilla movement that aimed to overthrow the government and establish a communist state. The guerrillas, known as the Democratic Army of Greece, operated in the countryside and relied on the support of local communities to sustain their fight against the government forces. The DSE was composed of a mix of experienced fighters from the Greek resistance movement and new recruits who were attracted to the communist cause. The guerrillas were organized into small units, which operated independently but were coordinated by a central command structure. The DSE relied on a number of tactics to achieve its goals. One of the most important was propaganda. The guerrillas distributed leaflets and pamphlets that criticized the government and promised a better future under a communist regime. They also used the radio to broadcast propaganda messages to the population and sought to win hearts and minds by providing food, medical care, and other services to local communities. Another key tactic of the guerrillas was their reliance on the countryside. The DSE operated in remote areas where government control was weak and where they could easily hide from the authorities. They also relied on the support of rural communities, who provided them with food, shelter, and information about government movements. The DSE's guerrilla tactics allowed them to launch successful attacks against government forces and to control large parts of the countryside. However, the government responded with force and launched a campaign of counterinsurgency that was brutal and often indiscriminate. The government forces burned villages, executed suspected guerrilla supporters, and imposed harsh measures on the population in an attempt to root out the guerrilla movement. The guerrilla movement in Greece during the Civil War had a profound impact on the country's history and politics. While the DSE ultimately failed to achieve its goals of overthrowing the government and establishing a communist state, it left a lasting legacy in Greece. The guerrilla movement contributed to the polarization of Greek society and to the deep mistrust between left-wing and right-wing groups that persisted for decades after the conflict ended. Today, the memory of the guerrilla movement and the Greek Civil War is still very much alive in Greece. The struggle for democracy and freedom that took place during that time continues to be an important part of the country's history and identity. Chapter 4: The Role of Foreign Powers. The Greek Civil War of 1944–45 was not just a conflict between different factions within Greece, but also a proxy war between foreign powers. The Soviet Union supported the communist guerrillas, while the United States provided military and economic aid to the Greek government. The Soviet Union saw the Greek Civil War as an opportunity to spread communist ideology and to extend its sphere of influence in the region. It provided the guerrillas with weapons, training, and other forms of support, and encouraged them to continue their fight against the government. Soviet propaganda portrayed the guerrillas as heroic freedom fighters, while the government forces were portrayed as reactionary oppressors. The United States, on the other hand, saw the Greek Civil War as a test case for its policy of containment, which aimed to prevent the spread of communism in Europe. The United States provided the Greek government with billions of dollars in aid, including military equipment, training, and economic support. American propaganda portrayed the government forces as defenders of democracy and freedom, while the guerrillas were portrayed as dangerous radicals who threatened the stability of the country and the region. The involvement of foreign powers in the Greek Civil War had a significant impact on the course of the conflict. It provided the government with the resources it needed to fight the guerrillas and allowed it to gain the upper hand in the conflict. However, it also prolonged the conflict and made it more destructive than it might otherwise have been. The involvement of foreign powers also had a lasting impact on Greece's relationship with the rest of the world. The conflict left Greece deeply divided, and the legacy of the Cold War continued to shape the country's politics and culture for decades to come. The involvement of foreign powers in the conflict also contributed to the perception that Greece was a pawn in a wider geopolitical game, rather than a sovereign nation with its own interests and priorities. Today, the role of foreign powers in the Greek Civil War is still a subject of debate and discussion in Greece and beyond. The conflict is seen as a cautionary tale about the dangers of foreign intervention in domestic affairs and a reminder of the importance of respecting national sovereignty and self-determination. Chapter 5: The Legacy of the Greek Civil War. The Greek Civil War of 1944–45 had a profound impact on Greece and its people, both in the short term and the long term. The conflict left deep scars on Greek society and continues to be remembered and debated to this day. In the short term, the legacy of the Greek Civil War was one of division and mistrust. The conflict pitted brother against brother and left families and communities torn apart. The government's brutal campaign of counterinsurgency and the guerrillas' tactics of propaganda and intimidation further deepened these divisions, creating a climate of fear and suspicion that persisted for years after the conflict ended. In the long term, the legacy of the Greek Civil War has been shaped by the way in which the conflict has been remembered and commemorated. The conflict has become a powerful symbol of the struggle for freedom and democracy in Greece, and has been celebrated in literature, film, and other cultural expressions. However, the memory of the Greek Civil War has also been a source of controversy and division. The conflict remains a deeply politicized issue, with different groups in Greek society interpreting its legacy in different ways. For some, the conflict represents a heroic struggle against fascism and authoritarianism, while for others it is a warning about the dangers of radicalism and the importance of maintaining order and stability. The legacy of the Greek Civil War is also reflected in the country's politics and society. The conflict helped to shape the political landscape of Greece for decades, with the center-right government that won the conflict remaining in power for many years after the conflict ended. The conflict also contributed to the emergence of left-wing movements in Greece, which continue to be a significant force in the country's politics today. The legacy of the Greek Civil War is complex and multifaceted, reflecting the many different ways in which the conflict impacted Greek society and culture. While the conflict itself was deeply divisive and destructive, its legacy has inspired and informed generations of Greeks, and continues to shape the country's identity and aspirations today. Thank you for watching our story. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so you don't miss out on our next video.